For this next page of the practice shapes, I am going to do activity H. And H says, analogous colors are adjacent on the color wheel. Moving around the color wheel is a change in hue. So if you can think of it like a change in color as most people understand it, though color really has different dimensions to it. Color has hue, intensity, and value. But most people think about the rainbow and moving through those colors. That's what we're going to kind of show here. Choose a secondary color to use in this column, as well as the two primary colors that make it. So how about, I haven't used orange yet. How about I go ahead and choose a secondary color, orange. And I'm just going to write notes on here to help you see what I'm doing, but you don't have to actually write on here. And the two primary colors that make orange are red and yellow. So in this direction, I'm going to be changing the hue more towards a red shift, and then down towards the bottom here, yellow is the other color that makes orange, the two primaries that make it. So we're going to start in the middle and we're going to be going one direction for red and one direction for orange. Excuse me, yellow. Alright, the instructions say, make a puddle of your chosen secondary color in your mixing tray. Use this color to fill the center bold box. So I'm going to go ahead and use this big well here. Starting again with my puddle, usually like a quarter-sized dollop is enough as long as you're not using a really, really big brush. That'll go a ways. Okay, use this color, so I'm using orange, to fill in the center bold box. Next, add 1 drop of parent primary color number 1. So we're going to go this way. This is going to be our parent primary color because red is one of the parents of orange. Into the puddle and stir it. And this is where sometimes if you have a kind of absorbent brush, sometimes you can just kind of pinch the color out there. So 1 drop fell into here. I'm going to stir it. Paint this new color 1 box up from the center. So that would be this one direction closer to red. Repeat for each box you move upward, so each box has another drop of the parent primary color mixed into the original puddle of secondary color. So here's some more red. Stir it up and paint it 1 above. We should see a shift towards red starting to happen, though maybe I had too big of a pile of orange to start off with. Alright, repeat. More red. Brush going away. If pinching a drop is too messy or too difficult, you can just touch the brush to it, but I was trying to measure how much in a drop is a drop. Alright, stirring it up and filling in the next one. So it should seem like my oranges got to more of a red-orange hue over here. It should seem noticeably redder compared to where I started. Alright, now I gotta wash my brush out and I'm gonna make another clean puddle of orange. Clean out your brush and make a fresh new puddle of the middle secondary color. That's my orange. Now choose the other primary color that helps make it. For me, that's yellow. Add a drop of parent primary color number 2 into the puddle and stir. Puddle of orange. And I've already filled in the center box, so I'm going to start moving downward immediately from there. So drop of yellow and stir. Fill in, going the other direction towards the yellow spectrum. Alright, we're going to move down another box. So another drop of yellow and stir. So I'm using the yellower version to fill in the next box. And one more time. Make sure that you're washing your brush out each time and you're not contaminating your original. For example, I've been dipping into yellow, but I need to make sure my brush is clean each time. I'm not putting an orange brush straight into my yellow paint. Alright, this should be noticeably shifting towards a yellow-orange hue. This is a change in hue that we're showing for exercise H. Maybe it'll show up better as it dries, but we started with orange and you can see it got noticeably redder going this direction. And then this direction, we went from orange in the middle and it should get yellower, noticeably yellower. I'll try to include some scans of these after I'm done and it's all dry. Next, exercise I says, use the wet on wet technique learned earlier from exercise C to fill the entire crazy shape with clean water. Then choose any color to paint in the wet shape, spreading the color throughout the entire shape as evenly as possible. The water should help you spread the paint before any of your edges dry. I will be judging this shape on how even the color is and will dock points for blotchiness. Neatness matters. Stay in the lines and paint carefully with precision. Alright, so from the last exercise I've since gotten clean water. It's not all orange anymore. It's fresh and clean so that won't influence my next color choice. Okay, so exercise I. Inside of this crazy shape, I'm going to very quickly try to paint it with some water. Like what we saw on the other page, when you put water down first, it helps the paint flow and evenly disperse itself. It tries to average everything out more. So this is one of the best ways to get a smooth shape, a smooth color. And you need to move quickly, because if you don't move quickly, all that water is going to evaporate. Alright, water in. Any color that you want to use. So why don't I go ahead and use some red that I already have mixed up. Now remember on the first page we talked a little bit about how the water, the paint immediately wants to spread out, and how when you're painting you can kind of pull that puddle along. So hopefully my first layer with the water, this wet on wet technique, is going to encourage the paint to evenly spread out and not be blotchy. And I can kind of pull that puddle along. If I keep enough paint on the page, there's a wet enough layer, I can kind of drag and pull that puddle along. Now, this is a complicated shape, so you have to decide where it branches, which way are you going to go, and knowing that while you're going down one path, the other path is starting to dry out. And you want to try and move quickly. So try to be neat. I know that my page is starting to dry out while I'm over here. That top section is starting to dry out. Alright, I can feel the way that the paint is moving on here. It's more streaky because the surface is dried out. I ran out of moisture on the paper over here. It's not wet on wet anymore, it's wet on dry. And so the paint just flows differently. It's going to be more streaky, and I have to grab and drag the paint more. Whereas when the surface was wet, the paint kind of flowed in this wave, this puddle that I could pull around and glide. And now it's more like I'm dragging the brush across the surface instead of gliding the brush. Thankfully I got most of it done before that dried out. So when you're faced with a complicated shape and you're trying to paint it in all nice and even without it looking too blotchy, the wet on wet technique can be a way to fill that shape first with water so that your paint looks more even. Even though you're working in a big complicated shape, the water can kind of help even it out and give you the time to go through those complicated spaces as you maybe work around something in your scenery. Alright, our last exercise is J. The instructions say, Use your pencil to draw a minimum of 6 shapes or divisions into the box so that it is decorated almost like a coloring book, and there's an example in the instructions. Using any hues, tints, shades, or tones, paint in the spaces. Don't paint adjacent shapes while they are still wet. They will bleed across the lines. Skip around so shapes have time to dry. All spaces inside the box must be painted. No white background or shapes, so no empty spots. Lastly, when all shapes are painted and dry, switch to a tiny paintbrush and paint black over your pencil lines so they are bold. If the shapes were not dry, the black will bleed into your colors. Alright, so basically the idea is that I want you to practice filling in different shapes and kind of thinking about how they touch and what needs to dry in order to avoid things bleeding into one another. Alright, so the instructions say a minimum of 6 shapes or divisions. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Definitely have more than enough. And I can use any shades, tones, tints, or hues. I'm going to go back to purple like I had before. Okay, so I'm just going to fill in violet. I said purple, I meant violet. And I could use the wet on wet technique if I want. These are small enough spaces that the wet on dry is probably fine. Though you may notice the way that the color looks may be a little bit more blotchy where the paintbrushes show more. If I did the wet on wet technique, it tends to even out more and be just more overall smooth looking. Alright, so if I want to add water, I can make a tint, lavender color, and I can't paint here or here or here or here or here because this paint is still wet, so I want to skip somewhere else like this. This is not touching it, and that's going to give time for my first shape to dry. Okay, so now I have to pick somewhere else that's not still wet. So this one is a little risky because the corners touch, but I think I can get away with it. So you want to learn how to bounce around, giving your paint time to dry so they don't bleed across edges that are supposed to be sharp. You also want to be careful of where your palm's resting, because if you slide across wet paint, you're going to have a mess. And this space, this one isn't touching anything, so I'm going to use some more of that same color. Now you don't have to stick to the same color scheme. You're welcome to use different colors. Alright, so I might need to just wait a little bit for this to dry enough that I can paint one of these other shapes. This is looking pretty dry through here, so I think I'm safe to paint that and not have it bleed. If it's still wet, the colors will bleed together and try to combine, and I guess we'll see that. Lastly, when all shapes are painted and dry, switch to a tiny paintbrush and add black over your pencil lines so they are bold. If the shapes were not dry, the black will bleed into your colors. So my paints have had time to dry. You can use a hairdryer if you need to. Use a tiny paintbrush. I like to use a liner brush like this. It might not look like it holds a good point, but when there's paint in it and it's wet, the bristles will stick together. So I'm going to dip some black paint, and I will sometimes get the extra paint off on the edge of the well here, kind of wiped it down so it's not going to drip everywhere. Another pro tip, if you spin the handle, it kind of twists all the bristles together and holds it to a tight point. And now I'm going to basically outline it like if I had a Sharpie. But this is a good practice run. I'm using a tiny paintbrush. It's also supposed to teach you that black should always go last. And the reason is because black is super strong and super dark. It has no problem covering all the other colors. And you shouldn't do it first, because if you do it first, then whenever your wet paint touches that black, it can cause it to bleed, and then that black spreads out and messes up your colors. So whenever you want a black outline or just anything that's black, try to save it for last in watercolors, because we layer things on. Also, when you're outlining, if you can pull towards your body rather than away from your body, your hand is going to be steadier and less prone to shaking. You have more control in the wrist when you pull towards your body with your brush versus when you try to like push away from yourself. You can also rotate your page for whatever's going to be a comfortable direction to work in. I'm just keeping my page in the same position because I'm filming. If I was normally working on this just by myself, I would probably rotate it so that I was always pulling towards with the brush and not having to ever try to push away. Now you're done with the practice page, and this also gets turned in for additional points.